thrilled to introduce Professor Denise Esserman, who is a professor in biostatistics at the Yale School of Public Health. And she's indeed the perfect person to deliver the next lecture entitled Methodological and Statistical Considerations in Implementation Science.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I made it up the stairs without falling, so we're already at a good start to this. I'm going to talk about methodological and statistical considerations in implementation science, and I'm a professor of biostatistics. I put 0, I think, equations in this, so nobody should be scared. But we're going to talk at a high scale about thinking about designing and analyzing studies in implementation science. So, I like this quote: if we want more evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. And so that, as Luke mentioned, is the idea behind trying to get to a learning health system, where we're continuously feeding back information and learning and going. And I will preface this by saying I'm a clinical trialist at heart. And so in the beginning, when dealing with the messiness sometimes of implementation science, it's a little challenging, but we really have to get to the heart of answering these questions, and sometimes that requires being innovative, thinking outside the box, and how we design these things. And really, what we want to get to is, how do we get what works, and that we know works, to the people who need it, with greater speed, fidelity, efficiency, quality, and relevant coverage. And so, really, from a design perspective, what we're trying to do as best we can, and as was mentioned, there's no perfect designs, is to get to how can we have something that's externally valid? How do we address the implementation barriers and facilitators that we may deal with? So what is actually preventing the use and sustainability of evidence-based interventions? And you've already heard some of that in Sten's talk as well. I mean, these are the things that are challenging. I do a lot of work in pragmatic clinical trials, and oftentimes a failed trial is really because nobody's implementing the intervention. It's not failed because the intervention is bad. Really, you can't get it to be implemented. And that's a problem, and things that need to be addressed in implementation science, figuring out those barriers and addressing how we can get things to the people who need it. And so we really want to understand things that may moderate or limit our robustness. So just because something works in one setting doesn't mean it's actually going to work in another setting. There are geographic issues, there's implementation issues, there's cultural issues. Whatever it is, we have to figure out how we can get past those. And also demographic characteristics, age, race, ethnicity, gender, all of those things could be moderating the effects of our intervention, and we have to address them. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. So, if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying today, and I will say it again, all design and statistical considerations are driven by the research question and the aims. You have to have a good research question and know what you want to answer. Don't let the design dictate your research question. Make sure that you really understand what you're testing, and then you can figure out what is the best design in order to answer those questions. And if you sat through epidemiology, you'll know HIPOT. So what is our population that we're trying to study? What intervention are we trying to test? Who are we trying to compare it to? So that could be usual care, a control, or it could be where you're looking at effectiveness between comparative effectiveness between two ongoing interventions. But who are we comparing things to? What is our outcome? And we'll discuss both thinking about it from a patient level or participant level, all the way up to physician, clinician, clinic level, to a community level. What types of outcomes are we thinking about on that scale? And also defining it from an implementation setting. What are those outcomes that you're interested in measuring? And then time. So how are we measuring things across the scale of time? I'll get it right one time. So this is a figure from a paper talking about kind of the research timeline, right? So first we want to, at the very beginning, study whether something's efficacious. So that's meanings like, in the ideal population, does it actually work? Moving through to effectiveness studies and then implementation research. And in between, and I'll mention hybrid designs, which kind of address some of those combination of effectiveness and implementation research. And really, implementation research is to try and address the strategies that we want to implementing evidence-based practice. And eventually, the whole idea is to get to improved processes and outcomes for everybody. So this was mentioned briefly, but there are 3 types of hybrid designs, and really, again, they come back to what are the aims of the study that you're trying to test. So a type 1 hybrid design, the primary aim is on clinical effectiveness. So maybe we're slightly earlier in that kind of pipeline, where we want to test whether something is actually effective, and then secondarily get some information on our implementation strategies. If we're in a type 2 design, we might be looking at co-primary aims, where we're focused on both effectiveness and implementation simultaneously. And as we move to a type 3 design, really our primary focus is on the implementation, where we're secondarily looking at things around effectiveness or clinical outcomes. And usually with the type 3, we already know something's effective, but maybe the implementation is moved into a new setting, and so that's why secondarily we might still worry about some of the clinical outcomes. When we're thinking about these, and you'll see that I haven't described any types of designs yet that fit into any box, like this is the actual design. It's all around what is our research question and what are we aiming to do in these situations. In terms of thinking about our characteristics of what we're interested in, if we're in a clinical effectiveness side of things, then usually we're testing some sort of clinical intervention. If we're in the implementation side, then we're implementing or evaluating some sort of strategy to deliver our intervention. Typically, in a clinical effectiveness trial, you're randomizing at the patient level or maybe some clinical unit cluster level. And in the implementation trial, we're thinking about provider, clinical unit, or system. And I say typical unit of randomization, what we're going to talk about is, and again, I will preface this by saying if you can do a clinical trial, that's the gold standard. Not everything fits into that box, and so there's quasi-experimental designs. There are other types of studies that you can do to address the concern. It's all about getting to a point where we can move science forward, and however we can do that in the best way possible. Typically, when we're analyzing data, we're on the patient level for clinical effectiveness, and we're higher up thinking about providers or clinical units or systems when we're thinking about implementation trials. And then, again, our focus for clinical effectiveness is health outcomes on our individual or patients. Sometimes we're thinking about cost, but we're thinking about what is affecting the patient and how are we improving their outcomes. Whereas when we're thinking about implementation, we're thinking more about adoption and uptake. Are we actually getting people to adopt our intervention? We know it works, but are they actually using it? And then we're thinking about quality measures, process measures, etc. So some of the things we want to think about, and again, coming back to we have a research question. Is the best design going to be experimental? So an experimental design involves most of the time some form of randomization, well, all the time some form of randomization, or quasi-experimental, which can have some form of randomization. We'll talk about the step wedge design a little bit. What are we trying to compare, or what are we able to compare is a better question. So are we only able to compare within a site? So are we only able to do things like pre-post, where we may end up doing an interrupted time series type of thing? Are we trying to compare between sites? So maybe we'll have randomization there at the level of implementation. So something like clustering, so we can avoid contamination. Or are we looking within and between sites, where we might be thinking about some crossover type designs, like the stepped wedge design or a waitlist control? And then I'll mention briefly quickly about types of randomization. So a lot of times we're dealing with clusters, not a very large number of clusters. And as Stem mentioned, one of his trials had small clusters. They thought it was because they didn't see something because there were potential differences in the characteristics of the clusters. If you're dealing with an individually randomized trial, you have a large enough sample size, randomization is the greatest thing. It works. You should get balance between all measured and unmeasured confounders. The minute you start whittling down your sample size to small numbers of clusters, that's no longer guaranteed. Also, if you're enrolling a cluster and you have a subset of participants in those clusters, the participants may not actually represent the cluster, right? Like if someone who's willing to agree to a clinical trial may not actually be who the population of your center is. And so those are things that you need to be considering. So I'll mention one type of randomization, which is called covariate constrained randomization, which is a potential way you can help mitigate that. So I'm not going to spend tons and tons of time on the experimental designs. We have individually randomized controlled trials where we randomize individuals to intervention or not, and we have cluster randomized trials where we'll randomize at the cluster level. I'm going to leave it at that. I want to spend more time talking about some of the different and more innovative things. If you can do a cluster trial, wonderful. You have enough clusters, wonderful. A lot of times this isn't possible for a lot of different reasons that we'll talk about. So, and again, I'm not going to do, I apologize, this is not going to be an exhaustive state of designs. You may be thinking of something that nobody's actually titled to design, that you have to implement when you're going forward. And so we're always coming up with creative ways in which we can try and answer research questions and do the best that we can. So a couple of pre-post designs, though, to think about. One is what's called a non-equivalent control group. So we're just going to capitalize on naturally occurring experiments. So we're going to put out, we have a group that we're going to put the intervention into. We're going to launch our intervention in a group. And then maybe, you're going to do it in Kuala Lumpur. And you have a similar city, someplace else, that is just the control setting that you can follow. And so that's basically a non-equivalent control group because there's no randomization that's happening. We're naturally occurring and we're measuring to look at this. It's more an observational situation. There are threats to internal validity with this study because we don't have what's considered an equivalent control group. We haven't set it up that way, but we're getting information because things are happening at the same time simultaneously. And we can also look at things pre-intervention and post-intervention to get some information. We have ways to mitigate some of the biases through statistical methods. Things like how well we can select our control group, how representative is the control group in terms of comparable to our intervention site. We can do things like matching. We can use what's called propensity score methods to try and make sure that they're as balanced as possible. The thing that we have to be concerned about in these situations, and again, it's recognizing our limitations while advancing science forward, is you could get things like regression to the mean. So if you're selecting a site based on the fact that they're the poorest site at doing something, time may just eventually move them closer to being better, right? If they're the worst. So we have to worry about regression to the mean when we're doing those things and thinking about how we're selecting sites, etc., into our study. And one of the biggest things in these situations, as was mentioned, is qualitative methods. So as you're thinking about doing some of these studies, especially when you have an imperfect design, is to help those studies using qualitative methods. And I am not an expert in qualitative methods, but they are extremely important for helping uncover factors that could be affecting your results and moving it forward, as was mentioned. Other types of studies are interrupted time series. So it's really, these are great when you can't identify a comparable control group or it's not possible to identify a comparable control group. I mean, we've all just lived through COVID and things are being implemented over time. There's sometimes no way to have a group that doesn't have a policy or have anything that's going to be able to compare it to besides the pre-period. And so we go with that, and we deal with the fact that we will be able to see what happened before and what's happening over time. The challenge with these designs is making sure that you have a good definition of what's considered the pre-period and what's considered the post-period. And sometimes that is extremely difficult. I mean, in the US, that was really hard because COVID moved in different waves across the country. So what might be a pre-COVID and a post-COVID period in, say, New York is not the same as potentially in California. And so being able to understand that and adjust and define properly those periods can be challenging. And we have to make sure in these situations, because we're monitoring something pre-post, that we can collect enough data points. Enough data in the pre-period, enough data in the post-period to be able to do meaningful analyses. And as was mentioned in several examples, right, there's a need to worry about confounding from other interventions. Life moves on as you're doing your studies, and so something that's being introduced separate from your study may have an impact on that study, and you have to be able to, hopefully you can address it, but be able to understand what may be impacting your results. So, step wedge designs. I will say, if you can avoid one, please do, but it's not always possible. Okay? They come with their challenges. So, to me, it is not the ideal, but it works, and we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of it. Up on the screen is a picture of several, so the top is just a regular parallel randomized trial where some people get intervention, some people don't, and on the bottom is the step wedge. And there is a step wedge, it's a crossover type design, so it's in that within and between so that everybody eventually gets the intervention. What you're randomizing is the time in which they cross over to the intervention. There's two different examples here. One is where they immediately cross over to the intervention and you start measuring. The second example here, D, is basically where you allow a period of training to happen before you start measuring again the impact of the intervention. Eventually I'll get the right direction that I'm going here. Sorry. So there's design choices within the stepped wedge. There's what's called a closed cohort design where all subjects participate from the beginning to the end. So you start enrolling whatever that is, and when I say subjects, with it, like whoever we're going to consider within the study, they enroll at the start, and we follow them forward, and eventually they will be in the control, and they will be randomized over, and then they will eventually get the intervention. That's a pretty difficult situation, and I'm not going to go crazy in terms of thinking about all the things, you could end up with a lot more loss to follow up, etc., from people thinking about a closed cohort design. An open cohort is where we let subjects, we might enroll new subjects, we follow subjects that we have, but that the time of exposure will vary over time. And then probably the most common one is a cross-sectional cohort where subjects are only assigned to treatment or control. So we're cross-sectionally looking at them in the time period of which we're gathering the data. Jeez, I'm really bad at this. So in terms of thinking about stepped wedge design from an advantage and disadvantage, and again, coming back to what is our research question, always framing it in terms of our research question, and then thinking about what are some of the other implications to answering that question. And one of the most common reasons why people are going to select a stepped wedge design is because there's going to be some sort of political or logistical constraints. So we know, or we have enough evidence to say that an intervention works. Then why are you not giving it to everybody, right? But we're trying to think about the implementation of that intervention. People don't want to sign up, even though that's the research question, trying to convince hospitals to join. They don't want to join because they want to be given the intervention, right? That's going to be our biggest constraint. And so that's when this design comes into play and is really helpful, because what you're promising is by the end, everybody's going to get the intervention. So that's really, it's also nice because of resource allocations. So you're rolling it out in staggered fashion. so that everybody is going to eventually get it. But if you're needing to train people, you don't have to train, say you have 30 sites, all 30 people at the same time. You can do that over time, and so it helps with the resource allocation. And then there's some statistical things that are nice in terms of statistical power, where it'll be, if there's substantial cluster level effects, or you have large clusters, this can be a more powerful or efficient design than just a parallel cluster design. Every design has its limitations or challenges. There's always the chance that you could end up with some contamination and carryover effects that can occur. Even though when you're modeling these, you're going to include time, you can still have a confounding effect of time as things are shifting again, potentially over time, because you don't have a concurrent control. You almost can never blind anybody who's in the situation. And the biggest challenge, and I always bring this up when somebody is thinking about doing a step wedge design, is that you have to be able to collect your outcome measure at every time point that somebody is crossing over. So if you have an outcome that's going to be challenging to collect, this is not the design for you. Because if you have 5 steps, you need to be collecting every time somebody steps over, you have to collect the outcome on everybody in your study. And so that can become challenging from a logistical standpoint, and it's something to really think about, right? So it's the trade-off between being able to do that, some of the other things that you have to deal with in trying to implement a study. Here's a few, and again, it's not exhaustive, some other types of design choices, and I'll walk through a few of these examples. There's factorial or fractional factorial designs, where these are really great if you have a multi-component implementation and you want to be able to tease out some of the impacts of the components. So Sten gave an example where they had a multi-component intervention and it worked, but they didn't know what the pieces are. If you're fine with that, great. Don't go with a complicated design, right? Simple is always better. But if you really want to figure out what components may be contributing to that effect, this is a good design to be able to do that. Because you can randomize individuals, clusters, etc., to different combinations. And then you can evaluate the effectiveness of those individual components or different combinations of those. There's adaptive implementation designs, and I just want to make sure it's clear. These are not adaptive designs in terms of thinking about adaptive randomization, which happens a lot in early phase clinical trials. What this is allowing you to adapt the implementation strategy over time, just like you would in a clinical practice, right? If somebody's given a cancer treatment and they're not responding, what's the next thing that you do? You might give them second-line cancer treatment, etc. And so these are the types of designs that allow you to adapt the intervention along with real practice. And there's 2 examples here, and I'm going to go through an example of a SMART design, which is sequential multiple assignment randomized trials, where you're optimizing treatment sequences over time. And people can potentially be randomized more than one time. Where in a stepped care design, that is a design where if they're not responding, you have a treatment plan for how you're going to move them along. The only randomization is usually the initial randomization, and then based on what happens, you will step their care up, but there's no additional randomization that occurs. And then there's single subject type of experimental designs where, say, you have a hospital, you do something, you take it away, you do something, and so you kind of do this on-off design. The biggest challenge with that is it requires you to be able to reverse the intervention, which is almost never possible, and so I'm just going to leave that alone and not go any further into it, but that's a possibility that you could do if you're within a single site and you're trying to figure out if something's working or not. So this is just an example of a factorial design and what's called a fractional factorial design, right? Resources are always an issue. So in a full factorial design, we have this example, we have 3 treatments, A, B, and C. And so we have 2 to the power 3, combinations, 8 potential combinations that we could be testing here. And in a full factorial, we're able to test all comparisons, right? So some people get A, some people get B, some people get C, some people get all those combinations, and we can study all of that. These are really powerful designs, especially if you're not expecting there to be huge interactions between the treatments, right? If the treatments are interacting with each other, then sometimes you lose some of the power from a statistical standpoint of a factorial design. But again, you can just study all of the components of your intervention here. A fractional factorial design allows you to compare some of the components. And so in these situations, depending upon what you really are interested in, is how you would design how to randomize the groups. So even though in this example, there's a group that's getting all of the intervention, you can actually compare some of the levels of in the analysis because there will potentially be no control group, right? So there's not a control group to compare A, B, and C to. So you're not able to really understand, is A, B, and C better than nothing? So you just have to think more strategically in these designs about what the components are and what comparisons you're interested in, and then you can from there, decide what potential factors, how you might randomize individuals. So this is an example I'm going to walk through of a SMART design. So this is just a toy example, and then I have some examples, hopefully, that I'll have time to go through real trials at the end. A SMART design, again, we're sequentially monitoring things. So the first stage here is a randomization. Individuals get randomized to treatment 1 or treatment 2. And then, depending on how they respond, so we have to define what does response mean, right? So what does it mean to be a responder? And depending on how they respond, in this example, everybody gets randomized. But that's not necessarily all SMART designs. Maybe some people get randomized. But you randomize people. And so to walk through, in the first top row, the individual got randomized to treatment 1, and then if they're a responder, they could get randomized to stay on treatment 1 and just keep going because they're doing well, or to be augmented with treatment 3. And so this is a kind of design where we get to understand strategies. The thing is that you have to really understand, and so I have all these letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. That's not really what you want to compare. What you want to actually compare at the end is the strategy. So what does that mean? Well, the strategy means, and we can look over to the, I don't know my left from my right, so that side, the table, not the figure. We can look at the first line. So the strategy is, you're given treatment 1 first. If you respond, then we augment treatment 1. And if you don't respond, we're going to switch you to treatment 2. That is a strategy, right? Because if you're comparing A to B, that's not necessarily, we have to understand the process by which you will go through to get a treatment. And so what these allow us to do is answer a bunch of different research questions. So one of the research questions we can answer is, which initial treatment produces the best outcomes? And I have this at 6 months they were followed, as an example. And that would allow us to compare the first 4 arms to the second 4 kind of results. You could also answer questions like, among the non-responders to initial treatment, is it better to switch treatment or switch treatment and augment it? Among responders to the initial treatment, is it better to maintain treatment or augment treatment? And there's a fallacy out there that giving more is better. It is not necessarily better. I do some work in aging research. Sometimes overwhelming older adults with too many things is actually detrimental and doesn't improve their outcomes. So augmentation doesn't always mean that it's going to be better. Sometimes it will be, and I'll show you an example where it wasn't. They found that too much actually was not the best result. And then which of these 8 strategies or the best in terms of thinking about how we might treat patients. And then the last one, and so in terms of its statistical analyses, these become using generalized linear type models to analyze, again, because we have multiple things happening. The nice thing we can also look at is when we're doing this, we're getting responses to make decisions. We have patient-level characteristics. We might want to think about more individualized or cluster-level factors that help spur us to one of these decisions. And so we can actually, can we develop more tailored adaptive interventions? And that uses more of a machine learning, which is Q learning type of atmosphere where we're going to really dive into some of that. So in terms of thinking about a smart design, advantages, as I just told you, we can answer lots of research questions, we can talk about some of the interactions between treatments, we can do things that are more representative of practice, and it allows us to adapt the treatment during our trial. We're not wed to one specific, we have to only give one treatment and follow these individuals. We can adapt like clinical practice. Biggest challenges and limitations is it requires a lot more planning. And it requires, because we have to be following patients on a more consistent basis, doing things like establishing what is a response and making decisions. And disruptions can have a major impact on the findings, as we learned during COVID. And a lot of times, these are great designs at answering some of those questions, but you generally don't have enough evidence to definitively establish effectiveness in all situations. So as I mentioned, covariate constrained randomization, I briefly want to say this, to think about this when you're designing your studies. It's useful in cluster randomized trials where you have a small number of clusters. And as I mentioned, from a probabilistic standpoint, if you have a large enough sample size, randomization is going to do its job. But when we have small clusters, there's a much higher chance that we're going to get what's called a bad randomization. We're just going to end up with imbalances because we don't have enough individuals to make sure that we have balance. So this allows us to allocate treatment so we can balance on key covariates. So we can use things, it's kind of like a matching, but it doesn't have to be exact matching or a caliber level criteria. And what we do is we set those and we get all potential randomizations that fit within our criteria, and then we randomly select one of those randomizations. So if you're doing this and you say have 5 variables you want to balance on, and you do the covariate constrained randomization, and you get a list and it's only got 2 potential randomizations, you shouldn't do it. You should change your list or change your criteria or caliber before you do the randomization. But you want to make sure that you have a sufficient level of possibilities to select from. But it's a nice way to ensure some balance on some key covariates, and so it's a good way to help ensure some of that randomization. There are other ways that people address this. There's propensity score methods, there's matching, etc. But this is just one way that I thought I would introduce because I don't know if anybody had heard of it before, and I thought I would bring that up as a potential thing to consider if you're doing a cluster randomized trial. So, analytic consideration. So I fibbed, even though, because I said there were no equations, but those are just joke equations on the side. But in terms of thinking about analytic considerations, in any of these situations, we're going to get into more complex modeling. Right? Implementation studies are often multi-level. So we're dealing with things we want to have to evaluate and constrain on and understand all the levels that we're analyzing at. And so that requires, again, being able to choose a correct model that's going to account for those multi-levels. So things like hierarchical generalized linear mixed models, and if I'm saying something that seems foreign to you, that's okay. That's why I'm not presenting a ton of detail on this. Or generalized estimating equations, or frailty models in a survival setting, are all models that will help account for clustering that's going to occur with individuals nested within a practice, and a practice nested within a healthcare system. There's things like segmented regression, when we're dealing with pre-post models, where we're going to look for trends, but we're within a pre-post situation. And as I mentioned, there's propensity score methods, which are used a lot in observational studies, but can be used in other settings as well, where we want to try and get our sample to mimic as closely as possible the gold standard of a randomized clinical trial. And so those are things like we could use methods of matching or stratification or weighting in a propensity score setting. Sample size, right? That's always the elephant in the room. How many do I need? How many clusters do I need? How many people do I need, etc. So sample size is dependent on a lot of things. It's dependent on what our effect size, what effect are we going to see? How variable are our results? How much is the clustering going to impact? How similar are individuals within a cluster? All of those things are going to impact our sample size. But what we really want to think of from an effect size standpoint is what is the impact of the real world on hypothesizing what we expect to see? So what's meaningful? Okay, so not only that, especially from an implementation perspective, what's a meaningful change that you want to see? How do we define that? In situations, small improvements may have huge impact, right? Especially on cost. So is that what we're looking, is it small impact meaningful, etc.? And so we really have to think about what are we looking to detect? For cluster randomized trials, as an example, what is often lost is it's actually the sample size is the number of clusters. You might recruit individuals within a cluster, but you're not gaining as much from that. It's really the unit that you're randomizing at is actually the sample size. And then you might have individuals nested within that unit. And so that's important to think about. And then it can often be very complicated, and this is where you have to engage statisticians, etc., because of the multi-level nature of the design, and also in implementation studies, and I'm hopefully going to show you an example in 8 minutes. So there are chances where you're looking at analyses at multiple levels, or if you're doing a type 2 type design where you have implementation outcomes and effectiveness outcomes, they actually may be measured at different levels. And so how do we define and calculate the sample size in those situations so that we're addressing both of our questions? And so those are all things that we need to consider in thinking about this. Sometimes our sample size is our sample size. And we have to think about what we can detect with it, right? So there's the ideal setting, which says you give me all of your information and I tell you what you need, and then you say no. Or there's the setting where you say, I have 12 clusters, what can we do to answer this research question? And then you work backwards and figure out whether you'll actually be able to do anything meaningful in that situation. So some examples, hopefully. And these are not my trials, so I will preface it by saying these are examples that I pulled from the research. This was managing hypertension among people living with HIV. It's called the MAPIT trial. This was a stepped wedge randomized trial. It was done in a low resource setting, so they're testing the adoption and sustainability of a proven effective implementation strategy and moving it into Nigeria in a low resource setting. And what they're really looking at is to evaluate how well this practice facilitation works on the adoption of task strengthening for hypertension control for people living with HIV. And what they were enrolling is 30 primary care settings, and then they were random and 960 individuals within those settings. And the primary outcome here is the utilization, right? It's an implementation outcome, how well is it being utilized? And secondarily, they're looking at more patient level or clinical outcomes in terms of BP control. And then there's some additional implementation outcomes that are secondary to that. And so this is just so that you get an idea. And again, these are quick examples to go through. So this is what the design looked like. I took this directly from their paper, which is, I didn't cut off their initial planning phase here. But they're using the second kind of step wedge design I showed you, where individuals are randomized, individuals all start in the control period, and then they're randomized over to PF, but there's a training period. So there's kind of a washout period of training before they start measuring. And you'll see that eventually everybody's crossing over, everybody has 12 months of treatment, and then there's follow-up period that happens. And again, in this setting where there's those T's that go all along the bottom there, the outcome has to be measured at every one of those T's in the stepped wedge design. So one of the considerations in a stepped wedge design is how often you would measure somebody, because if it's going to be difficult, but you can do it, you might have to make those steps a little bit longer. This is another example where they're using, where they were doing a SMART design in this example. It's a life goals where they've already shown to be evidence-based practice for people with mental disorders. And then, and I apologize, I didn't have a good HIV example here. So, and they're using this replicating effect programs, but what they're doing it is in sites that didn't respond. So they have a pre-situation where they introduced this implementation strategy, and then the trial begins for anybody who didn't actually respond, so it's the people that aren't doing well. And they had 80 community-based outpatient clinics and 1,600 individuals within that. And their primary outcome here is a clinical outcome of mental health-related quality of life, but then we have some implementation outcomes secondary to that. So this is their design, and again, they only have, in this, it's slightly different than the example I showed you, which is why I like it. They have the first level of randomization, so everybody gets randomized, and you see there's a circle for that little R over there. Sorry, I'm pointing on this side, people are looking here. There's only, not everybody gets randomized a second time, but there are some that get randomized a second time, which makes this more of the SMART than the stepped care type of design. But the main finding from this study, the prior step wedge study is ongoing, which is why I didn't have results, is that it's simpler, the simpler EF-only augmentation. So they had one set of augmentation or double augmentation in this situation. The simpler method actually produced better findings. And at both the clinic and the patient level. So both sets of outcomes were better when they didn't overdo the augmentation of the study. So this is a type 2 hybrid that I'm going to, apologize and rush through because I have 3 minutes left, where they're testing an implementation and sustainment facilitation strategy. And you can see that this is an actually interesting design of a type 2, where they randomized at the cluster and did things at the cluster, and then at the bottom, which I'm sorry if it's hard to see, they also randomized individuals within the cluster as well to different individual level interventions. And so there was a lot. As I said, sometimes these designs, people get very creative and complicated, and as long as we understand our research question and design it so that we can answer our research question, then we can potentially get a lot of information out of a single study. And this is how complicated their flow was. And again, this is really tiny. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but there are several stages that happened in terms of it. And what they enrolled is at the cluster, 78 clusters where they were testing one level of the implementation, and then they were randomizing within clients to test other levels. And so it's a really like there's a huge flow of participants through here, but it's a really cool study. And so they had multiple levels of outcomes here. They had staff level outcomes in terms of proficiency, time to implementation effectiveness and sustainment, and then client level outcomes that they were looking at. And again, it's a type 2, so they were focused on both co-primary things, implementation and effectiveness simultaneously. So, come back to, as I said, I'm going to repeat myself several times. Everything gets driven by the research question. Please don't forget that when you're thinking about designing any sort of study, when you're considering these designs. I will also say some of these designs are cool. Some of them, there's big buzzwords around them. Simpler is always better. The more complicated You allow the ability to potentially introduce issues, right? Or unforeseen things like COVID happening that disrupt your study. And so I think about it thoughtfully when you're considering some of these designs. And as you'll see, when we're talking about it, I mean, there's a variety of designs that you can use to answer these questions. There's experimental designs and there's quasi-experimental designs. And we want to be able to, with the least amount of bias, but be able to do the work as best we can. So we don't want to be limited in answering our research question by the fact that we may not be able to do randomization, right? Let's think strategically, okay, even if randomization is the gold standard, then we shouldn't study anything because we can't do it. No, let's get creative and think about it and, advance our thought process and our methods and our creativity so that we can do that work. And in any time period, we really do want to think about how is the real world going to impact what we expect to see in those settings. In an efficacy study, we would never expect to see the same effect size as in an effectiveness study because the real world comes into play. So be mindful of that in terms of the change that you may see as long as you think about it in a meaningful way. So I want to thank sponsors, and I have like 2 seconds to answer questions. So.
Does anyone have any questions?
Cool. I hope I didn't scare anybody. So.
Prof. Denise will be here for the rest of the workshop.
That's correct.
So.
Yeah. That's it.
Denise, propensity score matching.
Yes.
Some people that multivariable analysis should be able to handle that in the analysis. Others say propensity score matching substantially improves the efficiency of trial design. Your definitive answer, please.
I don't have a definitive answer. Again, if you have, and I will say, both of those are not ideal if your groups are very different from each other, right? So if you're, we'll call it control and an intervention, or exposed and unexposed. If they're very different from each other, and adjusting for covariates or doing a propensity score model is not going to solve anything, right? The whole idea behind propensity score and even adjustment is that you want there to be overlap between the groups because you expect them hopefully to be as similar as possible with the exception of whatever you're studying, the exposure, the intervention of interest. So I don't know, I don't tend to use a ton of propensity score. I think, doing a good job of that and defining a good propensity score is an art and a science in and of itself and being able to do that. So I don't tend to do a ton of that, and I also err on the side of thinking about propensity score adjustment rather than matching, because propensity score matching, you eventually lose people. You exclude them. So I don't think propensity score matching per se is the ideal strategy. I don't know if I answered your question fully.
No, that's good, thanks.
All right, thanks. Now I have to go, but I don't fall.
Oh, you have one more question.
One of the things that we heard in some of the stands, and there were a ton of people who have been doing this through, let's say COVID, where there are these disruptors that really impact your design and your trial. And especially with step wedge, where they might be at different sort of time points. Are there ways to really address that in your analyses that are ready for prime time, or are we just sort of like our gap between what we expect and what we could get is just going to be minimized? I mean, do we have any methodological ways for dealing with this?
So I mean, there's some, because you could think about it in the same way you think about like interrupted time series types of things or time varying covariates. But in my opinion, I think there's huge gaps in methods to deal with that. And I think that we weren't prepared. Like the methods are behind the analysis of the trials. I think we're, doing the the best that we can to deal with those, but I don't know that we have the ideal solutions yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Denise, for such a very clearly presented lecture, I must say. Next, we'll be splitting up again for the rest of the afternoon. So from now until 3:15 p.m., we have an interactive workshop themed Research in Progress. So the session is divided into track A and track B, and we will have two presentations on current implementation science projects. So track A will be held here, and the key discussants are Dr. Claudia Lopez from the International Institute on Global Health, United Nations University, and Professor Jennifer Edelman, whom made manuscript writing a lot easier for me today this morning. And track B will be held in the Maple Room over just on the other side of the hall, and the key discussants are Dr. Romana, who is the Director of CHERIA, or Center of Excellence for Research in AIDS, University Malaya, and Prof. Luke Davis, who was the keynote speaker this morning. These sessions will end at 3:15. There'll be a 15-minute coffee break in the foyer, and then there's another skill building session this afternoon at 3:30. So again, it's divided into two parallel tracks. Both will be on nominal group techniques in implementation science. The one here, track A, will be for using NGTs for cognitive impairment in older people with HIV. This will be by Professor Dr. Lynn Madden. And track A will be here. So track B will be with Prof. Rick on conducting NGTs in early antiretroviral therapy initiation for people who inject drugs. And that will be over on the other side in Maple Room. So just before we split up for the afternoon, I'd like to remind everyone once again who drove here, reparking validation at the business center just outside. Tomorrow we'll begin sharp at 8:30 in the morning. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and let's try to enhance implementation science practices in our center.